to them. Children of the night, what music they make.
Welcome back to Scored to Death, the podcast, the official companion podcast to the book Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. My name is J. Blake Fischera, and the book is available from Silman James Press. It features 14 in-depth interviews with renowned film music composers that have made significant contributions to horror and have worked with some of the genre's greatest filmmakers. It is available on Amazon and from other book retailers. The goal of both the book and this podcast is to explore the craft of film scoring and celebrate the amazing composers that do it. Today's episode is part one of a detailed discussion with composer and synth innovator Christopher L. Stone. As a master of sound and music electronics, he created iconic sounds for projects such as the horror cult classic Phantasm and the original Battlestar Galactica and Knightrider television series. As a composer and electronic orchestrator, his extensive resume spans all genres of both film and television. From Disney's Tailspin and Walker, Texas Ranger, to Swamp Thing the series, the Phantasm film franchise, and memorable collaborations with fellow composer Richard Blais on TerrorVision, From Beyond, and Prison. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. I wanted to maybe start off by talking about your musical background. Like, when did you find that music and sound was your calling? How did you go about educating yourself about it?
Well, actually, I made up my mind that this is the field I wanted to go into when I was 6. My parents were filmmakers, Andrew and Virginia Stone. They made movies like The Great Waltz, Song of Norway, and my dad actually directed Stormy Weather with Lena Horne. So I was always improvising on the piano, and they just kind of cultivated me over the years to go into the field of being a film composer, TV and film and whatnot. And so it just came about kind of like I guess you could say it was a family thing. But they also had a player piano. It was a Kanabi with an Ampico player, and I would listen to pieces on it and run the piano rolls at slower speeds and then stop it and then play again and run it again and play. So it's kind of like, I guess you could say the late 1920s, early 1930s version of electronic music. That's what really kind of taught me how to play by ear and kind of just play stuff just by following the keys. Then it just grew from there. And then I went and I studied in Vienna in the early 70s. And I had a short stay with Nadia Boulanger in France and studied with her for a very short time. So, luckily I had parents that had the money to do that stuff. So I was able to get a really good classical education. Then my parents split up, and then all the funding stopped, and I had to go to work. So I just went and started scoring like ads and things like that while I was in Vienna and scoring small movies, and it just went from there.
You've worked quite a bit with Richard Blais, and he described you as a fellow who's ingenious when it comes to electronics. How did synthesizers and electronics become kind of a passion for you?
Well, when I was about 9 years old, a friend of the family gave us a Norelco do-it-yourself, make your own electronics thing. It's like little spring-loaded things you put in resistors and transistors. And I looked at that, I went, this guy does not know me at all. I was practicing Mozart and stuff, I was like an electronic thing. All of a sudden I noticed a little picture at the bottom. It says, build your own organ. I went, oh. So then I went ahead and did that. And then I started getting a lot more interested in, just in pure electronics and actually creating that stuff. And so that started my love for that kind of just for electronics in general, and and electronic music got me started on that.
Yeah.
And then when I started scoring, low budget movies and so on in the early 70s, I happened to be friends with the director Eddie Dimitrich. He really liked me, and he bought me an ARP 2600 synthesizer. He says, "Here, you get going with this." And I went, "Oh, that's it's a it was a lot of money back then too. It was $2,000 in the 70s, but he just did it just to be nice. And so I started working with that, and it wound up making a lot of simulated electronic scores for orchestra, because I didn't really have that much interest in electronic music per se, like musique concrète, that kind of thing. I had no interest in that, but I was very interested in the fact that now I had the ability to make strings and French horns and oboes and whatever I needed, to actually do that with a early 4-track tape recorder. For a lot of years, I was actually making a pretty good living at just doing simulated scores. And I already had an orchestral training background, so the orchestrations were, kind of a shoo-in for me to be able to do that. And I did mock-ups and so on, and started doing more orchestral stuff with it. It's sort of like saying, here, this is what I can do with electronics. Now see what I can do with a real orchestra. And that's kind of how that grew. So it all kind of grew together simultaneously, the electronics and pursuing, the live stuff, the real thing. And one just sort of complemented the other and helped me to actually move into doing more orchestral scoring.
Interesting. And how did you meet Richard Band and start working with him?
Actually, it was through Eddie Dimitrick. He was working at the same studio as Richard Band's grandfather was working in. And so Eddie Dimitrick introduced me to Rick's grandfather. And, we then grew from there. He says, hey, my son wants you guys get together. We did. And that's how that started. And we also had another mutual friend, Joel Golds, the late Joel Golds, who died about 5 years ago.
Yeah. So
I knew Richard from two sources, actually. And this is way back, we're talking 1972, 3, around there. And so we all kind of worked together off and on, between the three of us. We'd all three get together quite a bit, actually, Joel, Richard, and myself. And, kind of like the Three Musketeers of film scoring, And so that's the story behind that.
And so I noticed on some of your early credited collaborations with him film-wise, you are credited as electronic orchestrator.
Yeah, that's kind of what I did for him back then.
I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about what exactly that is for listeners that may not have a grasp on what an orchestrator does, and then how do you apply that to the electronic part of it?
Well, orchestrator in an orchestral context would take, let's say, like a sketch, like a piano sketch or maybe a 7-line sketch of the different instruments, and then you take that, you fill that into a full-on score. That's what a traditional orchestrator would do. In the electronic sense, you take things like some basic tracks of like maybe some piano thing, a few string things, then I would embellish on that and do more electronic stuff. And it would also involve doing more like purely electronic sounds, like ambient sounds and things like that, laser sounds and so on, which kind of grew from that, because once you hone down the trick of learning how to create pretty much any instrument you want with a few oscillators and filters, then it's not a big leap to go into that to make things like doorbells and sprinklers and and lawnmowers and things like that, So I started doing a lot of that as a development as well from there. We also did a bunch of like special sounds for things like Big Wednesday, the movie Big Wednesday, surfing movie.
Yeah.
I ended up doing most of the wave effects using synths and my voice through a vocoder.
Huh.
And so, they actually brought me down with my gear onto the stage at Warner Brothers. And actually right on the sound stage, started doing sound design before it was called sound design, right there on the stage.
Now, why would they do that as a simulation instead of the traditional way of going out and just recording a bunch of waves?
Well, there were some sounds that were very, very difficult to record because you'd have to be on a surfboard.
Oh, I see.
In the tunnel. It was particularly in the tunnel. Because back then they just really didn't have wet gear recordings back then.
Yeah.
All they have are big Nagras, and no one's going to take a $5,000 Nagra and stick it on a surfboard and for the best. Hope you don't wipe out. So, but since I had some surfing background, I knew what that sound was exactly sounded like when you're in the tunnel. You know what I mean by the tunnel? It's when you're in the curl.
Sure. Yeah.
And the thing comes in there. So I was able to really accurately imitate that, which would have been it would have been impossible to do with recording back then, but it just would have been very, 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 very impractical.
Yeah.
So, and there were just certain sounds like that, like when you wanted to have the exact sound of what it sounded like when you really did swish on the surfboard, you wanted it to really go, really do all that. You're not going to get that from a stock library, and it's, again, it'd be rough to record that. So it just worked out better for me to do it with my gear and my voice and my gear.
I have a lot of friends that are kind of gearheads when it comes to this kind of stuff. What gear were you working with at that time?
I was working with an AMS vocoder and a Marshall time modulator and a harmonizer H910.
So you would record your voice and then alter it electronically.
Well, actually, I would do the alteration and the voice simultaneously, because you wouldn't be able to do it after the fact, because you have to kind of like coordinate the two.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Kind of like playing a violin. You finger it and then go back and on a second pass and do the bowing. It doesn't exactly work out. You kind of have to do this. So you get those swishy things. So I kind of do it with my voice and kind of manipulate some of the controls at the same time.
I read that you also worked on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Is that true?
Yeah, I helped out with showing the guys. I didn't actually end up doing the actual sounds, but I did set up the settings for how to do that, to make all the spaceship sounds and things like that.
Interesting.
So I was a guy that kind of like showed them how to go about doing it, and then Steve Katz actually ended up doing the sounds themselves once I showed him how to do it. So I kind of like I'm not credited on the movie for it, but it's like, I'm the guy that figured out how to make that work. And actually my ARP 2500 was actually part of the gear that was on in the show itself, in the movie itself. When you see that ARP, we know that the guy's playing in order to do and that was actually my synth that we used part of that synth actually to make some of the sounds. Funny enough.
Interesting. Yeah, I find the kind of stuff that you do really fascinating, because it's very different than a lot of the other people I talk to. In the book, I talked at length with Alan Howarth about all the stuff that he does, not in addition to all the music he did, but all the sounds of the Enterprise that he created. And it's interesting because people don't really think of that stuff as this, like you said, sound design before it was called sound design. People don't really think of that stuff as music, but in a lot of ways, you kind of have to approach it the same way.
Yes, in every way.
Now, with Richard, Ben, you've worked on Richard has worked on a lot of weird projects, but you worked on some, with Richard on some of his most interesting projects, like TerrorVision and From Beyond.
Uh-huh.
I find the TerrorVision score, which I unfortunately didn't have a chance to talk to Richard about, but I love the retro kind of 50s sci-fi feeling of that score. I assume that a lot of those tones were your responsibility.
Yeah, well, we kind of did that together in my studio. It was definitely a collaboration.
You are credited as co-composing the prison score with Richard.
Yeah, that's true. We did.
I would love to get kind of your perspective of working with him on that score, because he describes the situation as basically you guys sitting in your studio and kind of improvising the whole thing.
Yeah, that's accurate.
I assume you guys watch the movie, and do you guys go through the movie kind of scene by scene and improvise, or do you guys find specific points, the highlights of the film in terms of what you're going to do thematically with the music, and then kind of branch off from there, almost like tent poles? If you have any recollection, how did you guys approach that?
Well, just as you described, you start with a few key scenes, and then you fan out from there. Taking the themes, and I think we start off with the main theme. And then we kind of use that vibe in different spots. Yeah, when we say improvise, you got to understand that when you're writing electronic, well, there's two ways of doing it electronically. Okay, there's two different kind of schools of doing this. One is you got one group of composers. Well, okay, let me stop. Why use electronics and when use score? And the answer to that is budget. All composers would rather work with a real orchestra all the time. Anyway, no one says, "Oh, I know. I'd rather imitate an orchestra with synths than use the live thing." No. The reason why you do it is because the film company doesn't have the budget for you to go out and record a large enough orchestra to where it would make sense. You might be able to get a few players, but then the thing would sound really rinky-dink. So in order for it to have scope, in order for it to sound big, you either have to do the whole thing electronically, or maybe have a few live instruments in there to give it what we call point, so that you can have, you can pick out some of the live playing, especially when it comes to slurs on violins and so on. So I lost my train of thought, trying to think, where is I going with this?
Well, Richard just talked about why the decision to go completely synth was budgetary and also time constraints.
Yeah, well, they're both kind of one and the same, and yes, both. Yeah, they're both true. But when you say improvise, anytime you're going to do electronic score, you could either be the kind of people. I kind of divide composers into two different categories. There's the methodical and there's the visceral. They're two different worlds, two different brain halves, two different personalities, two different composers. They can end up with the same result, but they're very different approaches. So there are some people that will write things out on paper first and then try to realize that electronically. Okay, those are the methodicals. You got the viscerals, which will look at the score, do one line, go back and improve it, and go on and so forth. So and I guess you could say that's improvisation, but it's not pure improvisation in that you just play the first thing. In a true improvisation, you play it once, and whatever it is, and you're done. That's an improv. When you're doing it line at a time or chunks at a time electronically, you don't just lay it all. You just don't lay down one line and away you go. You practice with it, and you think, oh, this line works better here. Yeah, that works better here. And then you kind of more or less do what you would do on paper, only you're doing it directly to a tape recorder. In those days, it was a tape recorder. So it's not improv in the pure sense of the word. It's a kind of another way of writing without using paper.
I see. What gear were you using at the time? Because he talked about you were using the Waveframe.
Yes, back then there was a battle going on between Synclavier and there was one other.
Fairlight, maybe.
Fairlight. Oh, there we go. And then Waveframe wanted to throw their hat in the ring to be another one of these like $100,000 systems, because that's what it took back then, because it was like the price of a house for a gigabyte of RAM. So everything was done on a Synclavier or a Waveframe or any of those other things back then, can now be done on your iPhone. But back then you needed $100,000 to pull it off. So yeah, I was working with Waveframe, helping to develop their sound library. And it was a very short-lived company because it was just, it came in too late into the game. Emulator came out with their Emulator 2, and that just blew out. All the $100,000 systems just overnight became dead weights. So what we were using was a Waveframe, and for a tape recorder, I had a Soundcraft 24-track, 2-inch 24-track.
Yeah.
For the tape recorder, and I was using a small Sony console and the usual outboard gear.
Sure.
Had a few plate reverbs, a couple of those, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah, I mean, what I find really interesting about that score is we're looking at 87, 88, and that score has, for the most part, the vast majority of it has a really kind of organic orchestral feel to it. And I was just kind of really impressed to find out that you guys did that all in studio with synthesizers and stuff.
Yeah, a lot of the samples that we use, in fact, most of the samples we used were samples that I recorded myself in Yugoslavia back then. And in the early days of sampling, it was being done very catch as catch can. People would kind of like, do a half-ass job. Recording was usually done by people that were real bona fide recording engineers, and they, tried to script together, students and so on. In those days, there weren't big scoring sessions for sampling libraries like we have now. Now it's a massive production.
Yeah.
And back then it wasn't. So I really kind of was doing some of the kind of recording techniques, recording with larger groups that would be more commensurate with, say, the late 90s, early 2000s, when that kind of thing started to become more prevalent.
Sure. Now, when you say going out and recording your own samples, like what specifically would you record? I mean, obviously you're saying you had players and they would play and you would record them, but like what would you have them play to sample? Would it be like note by note or chords?
Yeah, one note by note. Yeah, one note at a time. Duh. Next sample. Duh. Next sample. Duh. Yeah, you want to blow your brains out in a sample session. Trust me, it is the most boring thing you could ever be. It really just, it's hellacious. It's even worse for the musicians. Yeah, so you have to be really, you have to be kind of conscious of them, because people that don't know what they're doing, when they go to sample brass, for instance, they'll have them spend hours and hours recording fortissimo way up high on the instruments, and they blow their lips out, and they can't understand why they're not getting a good sound. So you have to kind of like move the notes around quite a bit for them, so that they're not always blowing it out. Same thing with the strings. You don't want to be recording way up high on the strings for like 2 hours, and they're playing on the first string, like right up by the bridge.
Yeah.
Fingers are going to get bloody by the end of the day. So as part of the recording of samples, you have to be conscious of the fact that these are human beings playing these things, and you've got to really take their physical fatigue and what does fatigue them badly,
Yeah.
And you have to be very conscious of that when you're doing sample libraries.
When Richard approached you to work on Prison, you guys had been working together a lot around that time. No matter what the project was it at that point almost a given that he would kind of work with you around that time period, or was it specific because of the money and stuff that he came for your expertise for this particular project?
Oh, it's pretty much because of the money. If you need good synth work, it had to be done cheap. But compared to an orchestra, if he was going to do something purely orchestral, then I wouldn't be involved in that at all.
Yeah, but even stuff like From Beyond, where he was working with an orchestra, you were definitely a part of it, and the synth plays a very important aspect to a lot of Richard's early stuff because of the way he marries the two.
Yeah. Well, again, it comes down to budget. So what you do is you record, some of the big bombastic stuff. You get together like a session or two with a big orchestra, so that you can intersperse the live orchestra stuff with stuff that doesn't have quite the dynamics and things you can pull off electronically. You'll do it that way. And then sometimes you'll just take pieces of the orchestra parts and enhance them and add synth on top of that to fill them out. It's kind of a patchwork.
Sure.
It's doing a quilt, really.
Do you have any specific recollections of working on the Prison score? Specific pieces? I mean, you said you remember starting with the main theme, but I was just wondering if there's anything interesting about those sessions you can share.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember one cue particularly that we spent a lot of time on, and it was one where during a prison escape, I think it was. He was climbing up through the prison bars on the outside. If I can remember, I haven't seen the movie since we finished it, so I'm just trying to remember. But that particular cue turned out really great. That was one of the ones that we spent a lot of time on. Not that we rushed everything, but we didn't. But that kind of established the tone of how we were going to handle the rest of the score in terms of sophistication level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how much granularity you want to put into the score. You know, when you have time constraints, it's just like painting. You know, if you have to put out a tremendous amount of music, then you kind of have to take the approach of, those guys that you see on TV sometimes that paint and they'll show, oh, now I'm going to show you how I can do this whole landscape in 60 seconds. And right before your eyes, they get the sunset going with the big fat brush, and then they'll come in and they'll do the trees really fast, and these little snow things on there, and then the guy just turns around and there you are. There's the picture, and you see it, and it looks really, really cool from a distance until you get really close up and you see that it's not that it's sloppy. It's just that there's not a lot of granularity in there. It's done for effect. It's done so that you take one look at it and you think, wow, that's really cool. And then you take another picture that's done by a really famous artist doing these things in oils. That might be another landscape, and you look at it. Now you get a little bit closer up to it. Now you start seeing individual leaves. You start seeing, a lot more detail close up. That's what I mean by granularity.
Yeah.
So there's always that when you're working on it. It's not so much a budget as it is a time constraint. The composers are always given the scores at the absolute last possible second. And we're not talking budget here. It's just doesn't matter what the budget is. You're always given it the last second because they're always working on it in the editing room until the deadline absolutely comes, for the dubbing session where they put the music and the sound effects and everything together. So they'll railroad you right into a corner compositionally for that. They won't take your time into consideration because, they're the creators, so they create all this stuff and take as much time as they can possibly squeeze out of it, which is understandable. So now you have to fight and battle between, okay, you cannot give high granularity to absolutely every scene like you can with a very large budget movie where a composer could have months to work on it as opposed to days.
Yeah.
And even in high budget movies, sometimes they don't give the composers enough time on those either, in which case the guys have to farm it out and try to get granularity in there by having more bodies working on it. And that's when they really depend a lot on the orchestrators to throw in the granularity, all the fine little sophisticated bits that fill in all the broad strokes. What I mean by that, I'll give you a perfect example. Like, let's say you're going to do something like, you have a little action theme. And so you might sketch something out that goes down, like that kind of thing, right? So when you're going to put like granularity in there, now what you might have is the woodwinds going, and then have a lot of percussion things, all those little things that add sophistication to it. That's what I mean by granularity.
Yeah.
And that's time consuming. The more the notes, the longer it takes to write them. So you can always tell when somebody's like really in a super hurry because you start getting less and less and less granularity and more long notes.
Yeah.
It takes less time to physically do them, whether it's on paper or whether you're playing electronically.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, did you also work on the Battlestar Galactica TV show?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Again, I created the sounds for the Cylons, and I was called down on the soundstage again, only this time at Universal. And I brought my gear, which was my, the same stuff, the AMS vocoder. That was kind of my standard kit for doing stuff with my mouth, which was the AMS vocoder, the Marshall time modulator, and the harmonizer H910. So they had me come down to the stage, and I was there with everybody, like a whole entourage of people, with Glenn Larson was there. And in fact, I met Glenn Larson later, just before he died, a couple of years ago. And we were talking about it, and he had vaguely remembered me, but I said, yeah, we were there. And I remember. And so we sat down and I created the sounds. I got up there, did the microphone, did the whole thing. And they had another guy come in and read the actual, by your command, but it could have been frankly, it could have been a Google voice. You know, it wouldn't have mattered because it was actually the equipment that was making the noises. And so I created the patches and did everything ready for anyone else to come in and read it and do it. But yeah, so that's how I worked on it. Let me see what else. Oh, did the same thing on Pete's Dragon, the exact same thing. I came in, created the sounds for that. Wasn't a vocoder back then. I was using some other things. And again, I was down at the stage Disney, and we did that sound there with Don Bluth and his group, and had someone else read it. So you can say I worked on it. I didn't actually do the voices, but I created the sounds for the voices.
Interesting.
Oh yeah, the one thing which I did, which was all me, which was the Cylon. You know that the Cylon sound where their light goes. Okay, that's me. That's that voice. That's it. And what I do is I put it through a Marshall time modulator, so it'll go like that. So I kind of like that.
This was the light in the eye of their helmet.
The light right in the head, yeah. Which then Glenn Larson, he said, "Oh, I really like that sound." So we used it in the kit car. So they just took that and they put it in the kit car and slowed it down. So, but it was used in two spots.
So you created the sound of the light in front of Kit's car that my generation of people grew up kind of imitating themselves.
That's correct. That was all me. Just like some of the wave sounds in Big Wednesday were all me. That was somebody else coming in and just using my gear. So that's that's always one of those little fun things to remember. And I stayed in a closet actually. They just sent me over a 3/4 inch cassette, and I went down to a little closet literally in Hollywood at Audio Rents. Went in there and said, "Here, just knock out a sound for this, will you, Chris?" And I went, "Okay, sure." So I did that. You know, I wasn't paid anything for it. They just asked me to do it. Back then, again, there wasn't sound design. You know, if I'd had my wits about me, I would have gotten my SAG card. I'd be getting like thousands of dollars. So I never did because I didn't know to do that. So
was that the point where those kinds of things were being called special sound effects?
Yeah, probably. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was too ignorant at the time to even know about any of that. You know, I said, "No, I'm a composer. I'm not a sound effects guy." So, you know, it was a freebie, but it ended up being a world famous freebie. But that's what it was. But there you go.
And how did you become part of the Phantasm franchise?
Well, the sound effects editor on the first one was the assistant editor for my mother, who was the editor on my dad's movies. Gene Corso was his name. And he called me up and said, "Hey, you know, I know that you do this electronic stuff. You want to come in here and do some sound?" So I did it on the first one. So I created the sound for the dwarves on Phantasm. And there were some other like little creatures and things like that I also created some of the sounds for, and buzzes and stuff. And Don Coscarelli, you know, liked me back then and so on. So then, and I met Fred Myrow at the time, who's now been gone now for almost 20 years now, I think.
Wow.
And so when it came time to do the second one, again, budget constraints, he knew I could do electronic things, and I came and did the same thing like I was doing for Richard. You know, I'd come in and do electronic stuff on the second one. Then after that, Fred passed away, and then I ended up doing all the rest of the scores myself.
When you see the first Phantasm for the first time, what do you think about it? Because it is one of the most oddly imaginative original horror movies, especially for that time period.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's kind of like, you know, like they have Lost. Remember how you really never quite understood what all those smoke creatures were, and everything was all kept very hush-hush in the whole show about the origins of it and what everything was. What made Phantasm radically different is you never had a clue as to where these creatures come from, what are they all about, there's something very intriguing. So it made it a very intriguing thing. You kept waiting for the next installment to hopefully find out who and what they really were and what they come from, what was their origin. You know, like you do in most horror movies, it's pretty obvious. You know, you've got you've got your apocalyptic zombies. Right. Okay. It was let me guess, Government experiment gone bad. Boom. There you go. There's the reason for it. Right away. Right?
Yeah.
In Phantasm, you have absolutely no clue. Still to this day, you really don't have a clue.
Yeah.
And it's, that I think is what makes them so compelling, is that they're so bizarre, and the movements and the things that he does, like those balls that go out of the air and so on. You have no idea where they come from, what motivates them, why are they doing all this, what's going on, what's the ultimate goal. You have no idea. You just know that they've got to be stopped. So Reggie has to go out there and kill them all, and hopefully that'll be the end of it. Of course, it never is, thankfully, and so on.
So for the first film, you did basically some sound effects. And the second film, you started working directly with Fred Myrow. What was that collaboration like?
It's very similar to working with Richard and, in Richard Van, in that, come to my studio, we'd sit and we'd talk about it. He'd play something, I'd play something, we'd come back and forth. I'd set some sounds up for him. He'd play those. Sometimes I would do them. It was kind of like how Richard and I worked as well. Very similar.
That melodic theme has become a favorite of cult horror movie fans. And there's something that a lot of the composers talk about, that there's something to simplicity when it comes to horror movie scores. Would you say that there's something to that? And if you agree, do you have any thoughts as to why something simple seems to be most effective when it comes to horror?
Oh, it's very simple. I totally agree with that statement. If you can hum it, that you've got something that people can walk away with, and then when they hear that sound, it's like dee doo doo dee doo doo dee doo dee doo doo dee. I mean, immediately what's going to happen, Then the Phantasm, da da dee da dee da 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 dee da dee da da da, boom boom boom. You know what's coming.
You worked with Fred on 2 and 3 because he passed away after that. When you then take up the mantle for 4 and 5, working on a series like that, do you find that it's restrictive to kind of keep working within the same elements, or is it interesting to find new ways to work within that musical language?
Well, I don't find it restricting at all. It's kind of like coming home to a familiar old friend. First of all, I really love, and I'm not saying this just to say it, I really love Fred's themes that he did for that, and the way he interwove them, because you could use them in so many different ways without it becoming monotonous. And it was well constructed, I thought. His themes were very, very well constructed. And I always look forward to doing them. I would be thrilled if Don ever put together a series, that if I had to work on the themes every week, fine with me. No, in fact, I find it fun, because with every decade, those things come out. What I do is I try to incorporate whatever is the current scoring trend. I try to put that in as part of it while maintaining the core essence of the original. And so you're not busting the genre by suddenly going with a whole different thing. What I like about that series too is that it doesn't take itself too seriously.
Yeah,
it's not one of these. I mean, they know it's horror. It's almost like comical because it's so horror, And I think that's part of the charm of it. Is it's not an ultra, heady, serious. There aren't a lot of bad guys with British accents. Like, I'm a Shakespearean actor, damn it, but I'm going to do this horror movie.
I think movies that have that tone tend to benefit from having scores that often go way over the top, and I imagine that must be very fun to do.
It's a lot of fun not having to be one of those situations where you have to be, well, no, I can't do too much of that. No, we got to tone that one back. We've got to tone this one back. It's nice to be able to just go for it. It's much, much, much easier on your nerves not having to strike these happy mediums. You just take it and you run with it and go.
And what's it like working with Don Coscarelli? Like, what is his method of communicating what he needs to you?
Well, we don't have to do an awful lot of talking at this point. the way I work, way I'm doing it with him, and now, is I've kind of changed the way in which I work quite a bit than the way I did 20 years ago. Now, when I write, I take a very, very, very different approach. That different approach is I'll look at the show, look at the movie. We'll talk to Don about the different scenes, the different moods, and so on. And then what I'll do is I sit down and I spend a week or two or whatever long it takes for me to do it. And I do themes without picture, just write the themes and write out how I think they're going to, how I want to, and I fully orchestrate them electronically, of course, and really put all kinds of detail into it, right? A lot of granularity, which sometimes when you're watching picture and you want to try to do a lot of granularity with picture, the dialogue gets in your way, the visuals are distracting. There's a lot of stuff that can actually work against you working with picture all the time. And you tend to fall into some bad habits, actually, going for stuff that you've always done in the past because it's less distracting. So if you're working with a blank slate, you see the picture in your head and you write for the picture as opposed to writing to the picture.
Yeah.
You can then spend the time putting in the granularity. And sometimes you have to take that out for dialogue and so on. But at least you've got it in there. So you've got it as an arsenal. So you're creating kind of like a library, as it were. So I actually, before, on the last one we did, Phantasm 5, before I ever actually scored anything to picture at all, I already had an hour of music written, of just pure album material. And then what I did was I took that, mixed it down to the different elements, and cut it into the picture like I was putting in a temp score. Did a reverse temp score, you might say. And then took the parts that didn't work, cut that out, and added new bits in between and did it that way. Much, much, much better way to work. It's a lot closer to the way people work on paper when they go to write on paper, because when you're writing on paper, you're not looking at the movie. All you're doing is you're thinking about the music. So you can put all this granularity into it on the paper that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do when you're seeing the picture, because it's too distracting. So, I mean, I used to just write the picture all the time, and I never wrote a note without it, especially when I was doing the TV shows, which I always did it that way. And I learned that that's not the best way to go about it at all.
Interesting.
No, you want to try to write to picture as little as now my philosophy is you want to try to write to picture as little as possible. You only do it when it's utterly apparent that that's the only way you can do it. You don't do it as a general rule. Not anymore, I don't. Well,
obviously with the passage of time, and now that you've done so many of them with Coscarelli, how you work with him now is different than you would have worked with him in 1987, 88. But do you find that the way you guys communicate is different than the way that he and Fred communicated when Fred was still working on the series?
I have to think about that.
Because as someone that loves movies and directors as well, in addition to the music, I'm always curious about that director-composer relationship and how it works. Because, obviously it works differently for everybody, but also every picture and stuff. So I always try to get a little bit of a glimpse of like what that relationship is like and how the communication works between people.
Well, it's a dynamic process. It's not something that's locked in concrete in every show, because everyone grows and changes their and learns from their last projects and moves forward. So you kind of work a little bit differently each and every time, a little bit.
Yeah.
And I would say that what defines working differently is the more you work together, the less has to be said, and things can be said in a much shorter period of time. And it can be said in a sentence as opposed to paragraphs. And that is the biggest difference, is when you're working with someone like when I'm working with Don, someone I've worked with for, many, many, many times. Very little is actually needed to be said. And in this last one we had like a brief conversation, went through, looked at the movie, and then I came to him back with themes, and we started making changes to the actual themes before it went to picture. And we started working. I was just, I think it needs a little bit more of this kind of vibe, a little more of that, or have a bit more of this, more of that. So by the time we came to actually cutting into picture and working with the picture, hardly anything was changed. Hardly anything was discussed. We very, very few changes were made. Once I got all the critical elements together, and they said, I would roughly show it against picture. He said, I want to see what this theme looks like against picture. So I throw up some picture, we run it there, and I go, let's slide this music a little bit and see how that works here. Oh yeah, that part here, let's take that and move it onto this part over here. It's actually much more akin to doing a temp score, believe it or not. It's like taking the real score and treating it like a temp score.
And this is with Ravager?
Yeah, doing that. I like working that way, as opposed to taking one little scene at a time. Now, getting the themes together, because sometimes I take some of the themes and would look with this last part from this other theme here. We go down, through this whole massive hour of music we had. How about if we use a little piece of this over here? We'll go, okay, fine, let's take that. We put that on that spot, and away we went. What's interesting for me, just as a side note, I didn't ask this question, but I went through on all the scenes where there were all the ball effects going through the air and all the dwarves and all that. That was the first thing I did before I started actually writing any music at all.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to have that as kind of like background ambience, as well as getting it done for the show. But also the more of those sound effects that are in there tells me a lot more about how much granularity I can put into the writing and where I need to eliminate granularity. Because the more other sounds you have working on the screen, you have to really be very careful not to overwrite for those, especially like the chase scenes with the balls going and there's cars going every which way. You really have to make the music a lot simpler and more defined rhythmically.
Sure.
And those things.
That's interesting. So when you're working, just to kind of make sure I understand, so when you're working on a picture where you're working on sound design and sound effects as well as the music, the first pass is all the sound effects and stuff, and then you start working on the music to picture.
Correct. Much better way to work. Much better.
Now, do you find that a lot of projects that you work on, you kind of wear both hats, or is that kind of a rarity these days?
Kind of a rarity these days. It's not. You mean, because the only time that really comes into play is if you're dealing with something that's either a horror movie or a sci-fi. Other than that, it's always going to be done with conventional sound effects, which of course I'm not doing.
Yeah.
So there wouldn't be any cost for me to do that. So the only time I'm brought in, it was a one-time experience doing the Big Wednesday thing. Was a conventional movie, definitely not a sci-fi. It was the one and only time I ever did something like that. That had nothing to do with a horror or sci-fi genre.
Yeah.
So the only time I would ever do the sound effects stuff would be only if it had to be otherworldly. It had to be either off-world or netherworld. That'd be the only time I'd ever do that. So most of my work was not done in that genre. So yeah, it's a rarity.
Okay, that's about the midway point and a good place to stop for now. I, of course, need to thank Chris Stone for being part of the show. Please come back in 2 weeks for part 2 of this conversation, when we will discuss his work on the Disney afternoon television series Tailspin and much, much more. If you've been enjoying the podcast, the book Scored to Death, Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers is available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many other places you buy books. Or you can order a signed copy from me directly. Just contact me through scoredtodeath.com. You can also find and follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Scored to Death. Scored to Death, the podcast, is now available on most podcast apps and distribution sites, as well as on SoundCloud and YouTube. Please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show on iTunes or on whichever provider you use to listen to podcasts. My other show, Saturday Night Movie Sleepovers, can also be found on iTunes, Google Play, and most places you find podcasts, and on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at SatSleepovers. You can find Chris at composerchrisstone.com. And I should note that the short clips of music used in each episode are used strictly to put aspects of the interview into context, to audibly illustrate specific things discussed, and for educational purposes. The soundtracks discussed on this episode were TerrorVision, which is available on CD from Entrada. From Beyond is available on CD from Entrada and on vinyl LP from Waxwork Records. Prison is available on CD from Entrada and on its original vinyl LP from Varese Sarabande. Phantasm by Fred Myrow and Malcolm Seagrave is available on CD from Rock is Dead Records and on vinyl LP from Mondo. And unfortunately, I don't believe Chris's other scores for the Phantasm series have been released yet. Thank you so much for listening to Scored to Death, the podcast, and please come back in 2 weeks for this conversation's exciting conclusion.